feel like if you learn on Serum, you're very limited to what synths you can use outside of Serum. Serum's amazing, probably use it more than anything, but I know so many people that can only use Serum because they have no idea how an LFO works. An LFO is not a picture you draw. An LFO is something different. So like I like to teach on a normal synth so that you can use anything, because it even becomes easier when you go to some of the others like Massive and Serum, where if you learn on them first, usually what you're learning doesn't translate well to all the other options that are out there. So we're going to keep it simple and then we'll work our way up to some of the others. But just like EQs, compressors, synths are the same thing. They're just different wallpaper. They're all built in the same main components that account for 80 to 85% of the job. And then each synth kind of has its last like 20, 15% of bells and whistles that make it unique. But they're all pretty much the same thing. And when we talk about manipulating sounds, controlling sounds, it comes down to the same components over and over again. So a major part of what we're going to do with sound selection is going to require us to manipulate sounds. I think there's nothing wrong with using presets. I'm pretty sure I said this last week. Like if you use presets, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. They're there to use, but you'll never really be able to use a preset and just expect it to work for you. Like using a preset out of the box and just putting it in your song, 99 out of 100 times is not going to work. You're going to need to manipulate that preset to work for you, to work for your mix. So in doing so, you're going to see it comes down to a lot of the same shit over and over and over. And that's what I want to show you, those parts of the synth that really do allow us to shape our sound. So the synth consists of three main parts. We have the source, the modifiers, and the controllers. Source, modifiers, controllers. We're going to go through each, but anytime you open up a synth, the quickest way to be able to use any synth is to locate the source, the modifiers, and the controllers. And I'll show you as I open up a bunch in a little here. As long as you know where those three are and you know what they are and how to control them, you could use any synth that's out there. So source, modifiers, controllers. Let's start with the source. Source is going to be our oscillator or oscillators. This synth here is kind of an old one at this point. It's called Synths. This thing really just limits us to the basics, why I kind of like to teach on it first. So this has 4 oscillators, A1, A2. If I click B, there's a B1 and a B2. So the oscillator is going to be what's responsible for creating the timbre, the wave shape that we end up hearing. So inside, let's look at oscillator A1 over here. Let's first go to the wave section. And this allows me to choose the wave shape, which really determines the sound. What is it going to sound like? What are those characteristics? So for example, sound's coming through, right? So for example, if I start off with something like a sine wave, sounds a certain way. If I go to a saw wave, sounds different. What sounds different than a triangle? A pulse, half pulse, Q pulse, tri-saw, and they have white noise. Now these are like your basic core shapes, but a lot of the sounds we use come from these basic core shapes, especially a lot of your fundamental sounds. A lot of bass layers come from just basic shapes. Some basic lead layers come from basic shapes. What I always think that's cool is over time, aim to like understand what these sound like. They all have a unique sound to them. The quicker you can learn which is which, the quicker you can remake sounds from other songs. So, you know, if you hear a song and you go, oh, that's a pulse wave, that's a square wave, because you hear this, you know, you could just hear that nature of the pulse wave, you immediately have a head start to remake that sound. And that's where I find, like, when I do remakes of other songs, that's the first thing I ask myself, what's the wave shape that I hear? Is it a saw wave? Is it a pulse wave? Is it a Q pulse? So that's going to be our wave shape, which allows us to basically create the timbre. Now, when you have multiple oscillators, you can create more complex sounds by mixing different wave shapes. This is a pulse with a saw wave. So we have the ability to mix different wave shapes, but they all have their own unique sound. If you think about something like Massive, the synth, it gives us even more wave shapes to choose from with the digital and hybrid ones. If you go to something like Serum as well, endless options. You could literally drop a picture into the oscillator of Serum and it will produce a sound. So you can have endless shapes in Serum. These are basically going to control, though, what the actual sound will sound like. Get familiar with these, though. These are definitely your basics that every synth comes with, your basic shapes, and majority of sounds originate from here. And then as we get into more color detail sounds, they vary, but definitely good to know these by ear. So that's the first most important part of the oscillator is the wave shape. We'll always be selecting what's the timbre, what's the wave shape going to be. Next is going to be the voicing. So what voices in an oscillator represent are the number of wave shapes that this oscillator will produce. So if I have one voice, it's producing one pulse wave here. If I move it up to 3 voices, it's producing 3 pulse waves on top of each other. 8 versus 1. Notice 1 is quieter than 8 because there's 8 of them stacked on top of each other versus 1. So voices is just the number of instances being produced in this oscillator. Now I'm going to jump up. Let's jump over to retrig actually first. This will be called several things based on the synth you're using. Some synths don't even give you control over this. What retrig on Serum is called the random phase knob. It's in the oscillator. I'll show you where that is, but that's the equivalent of what this retrig is. What this basically means is every time I trigger my note, if retrig is engaged, let's say it's a pulse wave, which looks like this, right? So this is one phase cycle of the pulse wave. Starts here, finishes here, and then the next one would begin like this. And that would be the phase cycle from there to there to there. Now, if retrig is turned on, every time the note is triggered, it will always start from the beginning of its phase cycle. That's when retrig is turned on, or in Serum, when random phase is at 0%. That means there's no randomness. It will always start from the beginning of its phase cycle, which I will show you gives us a more consistent sound. Every time I press it, it sounds exactly the same. Now, if I turn this off, listen to what happens. You notice when I turn it off, we lose all consistency. It sounds like it's different every hit slightly, and that's because when retrig is not on, it is starting from a different point in its phase cycle every single time I trigger that note. So if you were trying to create this fat, consistent bass, you might want to have retrig on or random phase at 0. So you get this nice 8 voice. Is probably much stronger than. You also notice this jumps to stereo when the random phase is turned off. You start to get some different phasing things that go on with the different voices. But I just think it's more about understanding what each gives you. Because, for example, this may be something else where you do want retrig off for a certain sounding instrument. You may like that better than this. Oops. There's subtle differences you'll start to notice with retrig on and off, where sometimes, especially with more voicing, if you have retrig on with a lot of voicing, you can get different kind of like phase interaction as soon as we start to use this detune knob, which is going to be the next one we're going to talk about. So there will be times where random phase at 100% sounds amazing. Retrig off sounds amazing, but there are also going to be times where you want it to be consistent, strong down the center, more mono-ish, and retrig on is going to be the answer. You will 100% use both, probably 50-50 split. there's also nothing stopping you from just going like this and listening to which one you like better. So if a preset comes a certain way, doesn't mean you have to leave retrig on. Or maybe you want to turn retrig on. You could always do that, but you could hear there's definitely different characteristics between them. Minor differences, but they are. So just understand that those exist. Let's talk detune though, because this is probably the next most important one with wave shape, voicing, and detune. These three really are probably the most commonly adjusted. Detune is going to be how we detune the pitch of these voices from one another. So for example, say I have a saw wave, 5 voices. That means this oscillator is producing 5 saw waves on top of each other right now. I'll keep retrig on for the time being. And they sound exactly the same because it's the same saw wave 5 times on top of itself. But if I start to turn up the detune, the 5 voices, the 5 saw waves will all start to detune off the exact pitch that I'm playing. So basically, if I press a G note here and I start to turn this up, the 5 saw waves are not playing that perfect G anymore. They start to go off the perfect pitch, and it creates like that chorus effect. Or even like if you were in like a choir or anything and everyone's singing the same note, but everyone's slightly off pitch. Versus now, notice detune up with retrig on kind of sounds a certain way versus off. When retrig is turned on, what ends up happening with detune, they all start from the beginning of the phase cycle and they start to detune from one another. So you get this weird, it almost sounds like resonance at the beginning of each hit. Listen. It's like a in the beginning, which almost gives like a resonant effect. It's kind of weird when you start to turn up the voicing with the retrig on. Now, another important thing with detune, this will be heavily impacted, this knob, by the amount of voices. So this is a really bad thing a lot of tutorials show. When you watch a sound design tutorial, what do they always do with the voicing? They just shoot it up as high as it can go. Serum can give me 16 voices. Why would I use 1 voice? I'm going to use 16 voices. If Silent can give me 8 voices, why would I ever use anything less? More is always better, right? It also makes it louder, which is partially why people do that. Louder is better. But think about 8 saw waves being detuned from one another versus 2 saw waves being detuned from one another. That effect is going to be way more pronounced if there's more voicing. Not going to lie, this took me years to figure out. I could not get a specific sound I heard everyone else using because every tutorial just taught me to raise the voicing up as high as it can go. And everything I made just sounded like rave music or like 138 trance music. I don't want to make that though. Listen to the difference. I'm going to keep that detune knob there, but I'm just going to change the voicing. Do something like I haven't touched the detune knob. All I'm changing is the voicing, and notice the different combinations it's giving me. So between adjusting the detune parameter and adjusting the amount of voices, we have a lot of combinations we could fuck with here. You can get a lot of different flavors by adjusting the amount of voicing and the amount of detune. But keep in mind, the more voices you have, the more the detune will be, present and a prominent part of that sound, because the more voices, the more detune. The less voices, usually the further you can push with that detune. So if you find that everything you make just sounds like that over the top detuned sound, check your voicing. You can always like program the MIDI, turn up the detune, and now just start messing around where you adjust the voicing, you adjust your detune parameter, and you just find the combination you like for that timbre, for that sound, whatever it is you're going for. Same thing with a preset. If you load a preset and it gives you 8 voices, but you don't want it to be that way, go in and change it. Or maybe it gives you 2 voices and you want it to be more detuned and over the top. Pump it up to 8. You fully have the ability to adjust these things. Just understanding how they affect each other is important. So these 3 right here are your really big ones: the voicing, the detune, and obviously the wave shape itself. Panning allows you to just position oscillators, in different parts, left and right. You could pan them off from one another. Stereo is just kind of like the width of the sound. You could bring it more towards the middle, but we're going to talk more about that in week 4. Let me give you an important thing with this though. So like, let's say I want to make this sound mono. I could just bring this stereo knob down, and now my sound is in mono. Let me quickly I don't want to take anything for granted, explain mono versus stereo. When we hear something as stereo, we hear it as that full wide, like 3D kind of feel where it's width. We hear it out here. Mono, we hear right down the center of our head. It almost sounds like it's in the middle of your head. Now, what mono is, it means your left and right channel, your left and right speaker or headphones are producing the exact same signal at the exact same time. So your ear is receiving the exact same information in the left and right ear at the same time. That makes something sound mono. Where stereo, it actually has different information or at a different time in the left and right ear. So your left and right ear are not getting the same thing at the same time. That's when we perceive something to be wider. So technically, we started stereo with this. And that did make it mono. But that is not the way you want to do this. If you have a stereo sound, great example of this would be a bass layer. Find a great bass preset you like, but you want to make that bass mono. So many times I'll see people just do it within a stereo knob, or what's the easy way to do this? You go on your DAW's utility plugin and you just press the mono button, right? And boom, now we're in mono. No bueno. It makes it mono, but it comes with a hefty, hefty cost. Does that sound the same or as good as this? Whoops, the mono button's on. It's quieter. It sounds different. That's because what you're hearing is cancellation, phase cancellation. Now, we won't go heavy into phase cancellation because it's kind of a nerdy thing, but I think it is important to understand what it is and how we could avoid it in certain instances. By you just taking a stereo sound and making it mono, what you're technically doing is taking the left and right channel, which are different, that's why it's stereo, and you're taking the left channel and the right channel, and you're basically putting them one on top of the other and making one channel out of 2. So when it takes the audio waveform in the left ear and the audio waveform in the right ear and puts them on top of each other, any points where the phase is not aligned, like your peaks and valleys are not matched, we get this thing called phase cancellation, where we lose volume at certain frequencies and things can go in and out of phase. So you'll hear very inconsistent signals when something is being phased out, and they could also be quieter. We lose volume technically. So what you notice right away is when I press the mono button, it gets quieter. It sounds like hollow and weird because certain frequencies are losing volume. It's not the original signal. When you take a stereo sound and just press a mono button, it makes it mono at the cost of cancellation. This is what people do with bass presets when they want to make it mono. Don't do that because you're losing part of the signal. You can take a stereo sound and make it mono, or you could just fucking produce the sound to be in mono and there won't be any cancellation. So instead of, if I want a mono sound, why would I take something that's stereo and make it mono? Why not just make the sound mono from the start? Produce the sound to be a mono instrument, a mono sound. So for example, if I just bring this down to one voice, this is mono. This is coming down right in the center. Versus this as my mono. One sounds a lot stronger and better than the other. This one is a stereo sound with a mono button on it. This one is a mono produced sound. This one is going to show up 10 times louder, 10 times stronger because there's no cancellation. One voice will always produce a mono instrument as long as there's no stereo effects on it. Like if there's a reverb or a delay, sure, it becomes stereo. But if you have a synth with one voice, an oscillator with one voice, it will be mono. You load up a bass preset that's stereo and you want to make it mono, bring the voicing down to 1. Let's see if we can find a... I think we could do this too. Here's a good example. See how this is stereo? I could just bring the voicing, instead of bringing this knob all the way down. Hold on over here. All right. I could just bring this down. I'm dead mono now, where the second voice is what was making it stereo without this retrig on. So let's take another one. Let's say I wanted to bring this into mono. Let's see where. Not a good example for what we're talking about. Something different. Let's say this patch was... All right, let's say this was the patch. Sounds good, but it's happening all out here. A lot of my main bass layers I want to be centered in the mix. Kick and bass are normally centered in the mix. I could press the mono button. You could hear it immediately. It almost sounds like there's a phaser effect on this as soon as I press that mono button. Or I could just bring the voicing down to 1, where mono and its consistency over and over and over and over again. When you're producing mono sounds, or you want a sound to be mono, and this is going to be part of what we're talking about later, you're going to want this 1000%. Like this is part of what we're going to be building. You're going to need sounds mono. You're going to need sounds stereo. You're going to have presets you love that you want to be mono. They were originally stereo. Don't just put a button on it that says mono. It will make it mono at the cost of cancellation, which is going to sound horrible. Produce the sound to be mono. The easiest way to do that is bring the voicing down to 1. Now, that can change the timbre, because if you add a sound that was 8 voices with detune and you bring it down to 1 voice, it's going to sound completely different, right? 1 voice versus 8. Think about that detune. So keep that in mind. Like maybe that patch is not the one you want to use for your mono bass. Maybe you find a different patch for your mono bass and you keep that 8 voice one for a stereo bass, something along those lines. But with the stereo knob, these things that like these width knobs, they're not like the most ideal plugin or tool, especially when you want to make something mono. You'd rather produce it to be mono. You'll have stronger volume, stronger consistency. So the easiest way to do that is bring the voicing down to 1, and that will always create a mono sound. That's also the same concept of a monophonic synth. It only allows you to play 1 at a time. So it will always produce mono sounds. That's what monophonic synths are. Polyphonic allows you to play multiple at the same time, and you can have stereo sounds. All right, let's talk about polyphony here, which is kind of what I was just mentioning. So a lot of synths are going to give you this. Serums is in the bottom right corner. What polyphony means is how many simultaneous like MIDI notes or keys can be played at the same time. So let's say you have a chord that you're playing and there's 4 notes voiced in your chord, right? Like the actual chord is built with 4 MIDI notes. You're playing 4 notes at the same time. You have to make sure your polyphony is set to at least 4 to be able to play all 4 of those notes. Keep that in mind. Serum has this in the bottom right corner, but that's what that is. However many notes are going to be played in your chords, you want to make sure that the minimum is at least here so that it's not omitting one of those notes and leaving it out. This has to match at least the voicing in your chords. If you turn this up all the way and just say, hey, screw it, let's just turn it up all the way, it does increase the CPU usage of the synth a lot of times too. So like, I just keep it basically at what I need. Why I mention this though, some synths based on the preset will change the polyphony number. You might have started with the polyphony set at 5 and you were fine. Any chord you had in your song, there were no more than 5 notes. But then let's say you change the preset and it drops the polyphony in whatever synth you're using to 2. Now all of a sudden it can only play 2 notes out of your chords. And all your chords are voiced with 3 or 4 notes, you're going to be missing the notes. It's not going to sound right. You're going to be like, oh shit, what's wrong? Just make sure that that number is always set to something that will be able to play all the notes in your chord. So you just count them up. However many notes are voiced, you always want to make sure the polyphony is set to cover that number. Does that make sense? Okay. Next part is the note and octave. This is heavily, heavily used. So what we're able to do with our oscillators, as we start to use more and more oscillators, we can start to vary the octave and notes between them. So for example, let's say on this first oscillator, I have a saw wave and I want to drop it down an octave. I could just lower the octave and now it's playing the same note, 1 octave lower. All right, then let's say on the second oscillator, I want to bring in another saw wave. Let's go 1 octave higher. Add a voice. So this one's playing the note I'm pressing minus an octave. This one's playing the note I'm pressing plus an octave. And if I want, I could even make like a chord where I can change the actual half steps. So let's say I go to +7, which makes a perfect fifth. So this oscillator is making a chord by playing 1 octave higher and playing +7 half steps, which makes a fifth. So I'm pressing 1 note and it's making an entire kind of like power chord out of this. And it's cool. Like you could start to vary these things and make some really cool shit. Obviously too, you could have different wave shapes. Like I could have a sine in my lower octave, a saw in the higher octave, and I'll show you, like I use this for a lot of my sub bass patches. So this right here, it's not processed yet. I haven't like EQ'd anything, but this is the foundation for a lot of my sub basses when I need to like cover more frequency with it. So a lot of times we just hear sine waves are great for sub bass, which is true. This is a sine wave. A sine wave only consists of 1 fundamental frequency. That's why it's great for sub bass. It's very easy to manipulate, very easy to control. But what do we always hear? The sine wave doesn't translate well on small speakers. So what do people always tell you to do? Saturate the sub. You gotta saturate your sub so it could be heard on small speakers. And everyone throws this phrase around like it's easy. Like you just put saturation on it. You ever notice how much saturation you need to put on a sub to be able to hear it on small speakers? It's a lot. Like you need to distort the fuck out of your sub in order to hear it on small speakers. But what does saturation do? Saturation just adds distortion, frequency above this peak. Technically, I could create that same effect. Like I could probably show you here. Put some drive on. So this is saturation. And And it sounds good. Like it does add that harmonic distortion. It's in a harmonic series, like the analog domain. We spoke about that last week. But I don't have much control over the saturation, where I can achieve a very similar effect by bringing in these harmonic overtones in a saw wave. Notice I have volume control on those overtones. And if I just put an EQ on this, now let's say I want less overtones. I have a volume knob. If I want more, I have a volume knob. If I want more or less EQ-wise, I could control them here. You don't get that kind of control with saturation. Saturation's like it either adds those frequencies or it doesn't. You don't get to shape them. You don't get to do much with them. You want to also see something cool? What happens if I want these to be stereo? I could do that and detune them. I get so much more control over a patch like this by using two oscillators, separating their octaves. And the coolest part about this is understanding that they're not going to compete with each other. Next week, we're going to talk about low-end mixing. And these peaks that I'm looking at may mean nothing to you now. Next week, they're everything. You're going to know exactly how loud they need to be, why they need to be a certain volume, where they should be sitting. And you're going to want independent control over both those peaks because you're going to need them to be at certain levels down here. I can do that when I have each of these on their own volume fader here. So like understanding oscillators and wave shapes, how a sine wave produces one fundamental tone at the bottom. And then when I bring in the saw wave above it, it doesn't get in the way because the sine doesn't have any overtones. They stay clear from one another. The saw wave takes up everything above. The sine wave plays below. If I want more or less of that distorted sound, I could always bring the saw wave up. And truthfully, I could still saturate this and have control. So this is like a really practical sub bass that'll translate across a ton of different devices. It's a sine wave in the lower octave, which is nice, what we typically want. Saw wave in the octave above. And I just treat that saw wave as the distortion, as the harmonics, as the overtones. And it becomes very easy to mix. But to me, this is just understanding a synth, understanding wave shapes, understanding how to separate them and control them to fit my needs. Because a lot of what you're going to start to see with low-end mixing next week, you're not going to be able to do it by ear. We don't hear low-end accurately. Like what you hear, you're going to learn next week means nothing. You can't trust your ears when it comes to low-end because we don't hear sub-frequency, right? When you go to the club, how many of you put your ear up against the subwoofer to understand it? You're deaf, right? You feel it. You absorb those frequencies. Low-end has such a long wavelength. It takes time and space to be able to produce those. How the hell are your headphones doing it? They're not, to be, give you the spoiler alert. How are your little speakers in your studio doing it? They're not, to give you a spoiler alert. What you hear for your low end, that's why it doesn't translate when you show up to the club. Because what you hear is not what it's doing. We're going to have to understand metering wise for low end, if you don't have a sub, how to get these things correct. And the more control you have over those peaks, the better. So sine waves are great wave shapes for sub bass because they're very easy to control. It's that one peak. We can get it exactly where we need it to be. That's why sine waves are amazing. As you start to climb up the ladder, though, something like a saw wave produces those overtones, all of those frequencies, which is nice when you want to translate across, laptops, earbuds. You could still use a saw wave too for like a sub bass type thing in a lower octave. Something like this. You see, it still gives us the overtones. We still have that lower peak. What's the disadvantage? I'm going to ask all of you and see if you could kind of come up with what would be a disadvantage if I had to fit this in having only a saw wave. What could potentially be a disadvantage?
Too much overlay?
Too much shit going on, right? So yeah, exactly. Like, let's say I hold this and I say, okay, I need this peak to be at a certain level, but I need this other stuff to be at a different level. How are you going to make that work with a saw wave? Now you got to like open up an EQ, start fudging it around and really kind of shifting things. It requires a lot more work. So it definitely gets used. We will use saw waves, but it's kind of understanding what those options are. And to me, it's more so just understanding the basics of using multiple oscillators, using basic wave shapes as well. So let's jump down now. I want to talk about, that was the source in its most basic form. We'll look at some of the addeds that come in with Serum and things like that. But that's the basic of a source. Wave shape, voicing, retrig or random phase, the detuning, and really the octave and note. Those are going to be your big ones. As we jump to the modifiers, we're going to have two of them. Always want to locate both. First is an easy one. We don't have to think of this because they're software, but an amp on your synth is very important, a hardware synth, because it amplifies the volume. For us, we always want to locate the output, just understanding where it is. And, if it is in the red, give yourself the headroom, just pull it down. So I'll always locate where's my master output. A lot of presets do come in the red. It's not the worst thing in the world. At some point, we have to bring those down, though. So I always like to just make sure I bring it down early. But amp will be one of your modifiers. The more important one is going to be, though, your filter control. Filters in your synth are also considered modifiers because they modify the frequency. So just like a filter we looked at last week, high pass, low pass, band pass, notch, all the other kinds that will be in Serum, the formants, the scream filters, all these other things that synths give you, they're still filters at the end of the day, and it allows you to filter your actual synth signal. So you could do it within the synth. If I take, let's say, this same sound, and I don't want to use an EQ out here, I want to do it inside the synth, I could do that. There's a low pass filter, and I'm able to do it. If I want to go to a high pass filter, now I'm taking out the low end with a high pass filter. All right, let's say I wanted to make my own white noise sweep. Put some voices of white noise in here. I'm going to do a band pass filter. We'll crank up the resonance. And now, when you sit there for an hour looking for the right white noise sweep that perfectly is timed with your build up, just fucking make it. Open up a bandpass filter, automate this thing to turn how you want, or even if you just want a simple down kind of white noise, like a downlifter, you can time this thing however you want. I always used to use samples. I use this way more now. Almost in everything I do, I will always have one track that's like my own white noise, because it's nice when you just want subtle like ups and downs that are timed exactly like rhythmically with your track. It's so fucking easy to make. And you'll see too, like the other things we're able to do to this as I get into LFOs, you can make the sound 10 times cooler too. But this is just a bandpass with white noise. You could even make like ride cymbals if you wanted to, or like hi-hat type stuff with this, just by using filters to get the kind of shape and frequencies you want. The filters are a huge part. This would just be like basic filtering. If you just wanted to use it like a normal filter. We're going to talk about using filters in mod envelopes, these things, in a little bit, but this would just be like basic filtering for now. You'll always have filters in your synth that allow you to, cut frequencies and shape your sound that way. So source, modifiers. Source was oscillator. Modifiers are going to be our filter and our amp, our volume. Always locate that volume knob. Finally, for controllers, we're going to have two of them. We're going to have our LFOs and our envelopes. So the controllers are going to be the LFOs and envelopes. Let's start with envelopes. And truthfully, I want to say that like next to the wave shape, which will produce the timbre of the sound, this is the single next most important thing by far. Your mix is purely dependent on your ability to shape your sounds through envelopes. I'm going to repeat that again. quality of your mix will come down to your ability to shape sounds through envelopes. If your mix is lifeless, it's because your envelopes are lifeless. If your track is not punchy, it's because your envelopes are not punchy. Your track is like long and weak and drawn out and messy, it's because your envelopes are messy. This is something that I wish I understood early on, and now I put such an emphasis on it because it's such a game changer for quality. These are like the most important thing when it comes to the quality of your mix. Like I think everyone's going to start to see this each week. You're probably already starting to notice it, but when I hear people tell me they struggle with mixing, they don't struggle with mixing. They struggle with production and sound selection. That's why they struggle with mixing. This right here, I'm going to say accounts for 95% of people who struggle with sound selection. They use way too long of sounds. Their sounds are not shaped accordingly. So we talked about dynamics last week, the importance of dynamics. The listener loves dynamic range. As producers and mix engineers, we hate dynamic range because it's hard to find consistency. But a lot of presets and sounds you open, you have to understand are always going to be longer than you need. And the reason why is a preset is heard on its own. Think about it. When you load up a preset, you're listening to it in solo mode by itself. Imagine if the sound was just blip, blip, blip. That's not enough volume. Like you can't hear shit. That's not enough. So what do? Long synths, long tails, long reverbs. Everything is so lush and long because it sounds better. But then what happens when you put a lot of long sounds on top of each other in your mix? Overlap, 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 overlap. Before you know it, your track is a mess. You want punchy, dynamic, hitting songs? Your sounds have to be shaped that way. Envelopes allow us to shape our sound. So quickly, let's go through the parameters, and then I want to show you some examples of using them and some cool little things that are important. So quickly, whenever we talk about envelopes, we're always going to see a shape that looks like this. And the four letters are ADSR. So attack, decay, sustain, release. Attack is a measurement of time. This is going to be milliseconds to seconds. So attack is a measurement of time. Decay is also a measurement of time. Milliseconds to seconds. Sustain is a decibel level. This is a volume level. So sustain is a measurement of dB, decibels, that's volume. And release is a measurement of time. Okay, so three of them are time, one of them is volume. How long it takes these to happen and how loud this is going to be. Attack, decay, sustain, release. So attack, the amount of time it takes your sound to reach its loudest point is the attack. Think of it as the front of your sound, how we shape the front of the sound. Is it a slow climb in volume at the beginning where it goes jump, something like that? Or does the sound just smack immediately and hit right away? The amount of time it takes for that volume to reach its loudest point is the attack. But think of it as the way to shape the front of your sound. Does it start immediately or does it wait a little and gradually start? That is going to be your attack. And I'm going to give examples, but for now, just think of it as shaping the front of your sound. Now, the middle two work hand in hand in a way, decay and sustain. So decay is the amount of time it then takes your sound, the amount of time it takes to reach a level of sustain. So we need to define sustain in order to kind of complete this. The amount of time it takes to reach a level of sustain. Sustain is when the volume holds out at a consistent level. So if I just have my volume and it's that same consistent level, that is a level of sustain. It's the same volume level, just consistently holding. So attack is how long it takes to reach its loudest point. Decay is then the time from that point to a level of sustain. So if you have a very short decay, it immediately reaches a level of sustain. If you have a longer decay, the volume will take X amount of time to reach that level of sustain. And I'm going to show you this in a sec. Release is just the tail end of the sound, how long it takes the sound to fade away. The tail of the sound, how long it takes until it goes to silence. A lot of times the release is one of the biggest killers on your presets. Your presets will crank up the release so that there's this nice lush tail, but then what ends up happening is all of your sounds with their long release just start to bleed one into the next. And all of a sudden we start to lose dynamics because every tail is just bleeding into the next, bleeding into the next, bleeding into the next. And we don't have dynamic range. We start to lose the gaps between each hit. So let me show you some examples here of how ADSR will shape our sound. So let's just take this basic sound and I'm going to bring everything down to start. Now we're not hearing anything. If I start to bring the attack up, all right, we're getting some volume. So I'm holding the note down and here you notice it kind of like slowly climbs up and then it stops. All right, so why did it slowly climb up? Well, I started to slow the attack down, how long it takes to reach its loudest point. If I speed it up, you'll notice it reaches quicker. If I go even further, it takes longer. And I'm still holding the note down and it stopped. So why is it stopping though? Well, we look at the other parameters, decay, sustain, and release. So it's taking X amount of time to reach its loudest point. Then the decay is what? How long it takes to reach a level of sustain. So my decay right now is set to instantaneous time to reach a level of sustain. But what is my sustain set at? Silence. So it's basically taking a certain amount of time to reach its loudest point, then instantly holding out at silence. That's why we're not hearing anything. Now I haven't let go of this note. I'm still holding it down. If I start to bring the level of sustain up, notice we hear it again. All right, so let's try some stuff here. Let's bring the attack instant. So it's going to instantly reach its loudest point, and then it's going to take this much time to reach this level of sustain. So what I like to do too is watch the VU meter over here, this thing. You'll watch the lights. So it's going to start loud because we have a fast attack. It's going to take a little time, and then it's going to hold out. Now, if I wanted it to hold out at a louder volume, I could just bring this up. Do it again. So you notice it's like bah, and then it kind of dials back a little. We're creating dynamic range here. It gets louder, then it gets a little quieter and holds. Now, let's say I wanted it to be even quicker. I don't want it to take so long to reach a level of sustain. I could bring this down a bit. Do you notice how the decay creates more dynamics? Without decay, it's just like a blob. It just goes, bah. It's just like sausage, right? It's just volume. When you look at those audio waveforms where it's just a thick volume thing, where if I do add a little bit of decay, notice it kind of goes pop at the beginning, like there's that quick little pop because it's reaching the loudest point and then taking a little time to go down. So when I add a little bit of decay, it's actually giving me more dynamics where now it's going like this rather than just going like this. By adding decay, I get this little piece here. But this is what the ADSR allows me to control, the shape and dynamics of my sound. Now release, if I let go, it's still continuing and it slowly fades out. So I always like to ask myself, what's the nature of my sound? Does my ADSR reflect that? If I'm going for a short pluck, my ADSR should reflect this. So here's a good example. Hear how the tails of these are kind of bleeding over? The tail is so long on the release versus now, if I wanted to make something longer, sustained chords, probably want to turn my sustain up. Maybe I want to make like a soft pad. I could slow my attack down so it kind of gradually goes in. This is just going to be our shape. Now, why this is important. When you load up a preset and it tells you it's a bass preset, does that mean it's a bass preset? No. It's just a color. And you could use that color to paint whatever the hell you want if you're comfortable changing the shape, going in the oscillators and adjusting voicing and octaves. Just because something tells you a bass doesn't mean you have to use it as your bass. To me, presets are just colors. They're crayons, right? They're different colors I can color with. But I can turn sounds into whatever I want by using ADSR. So like, for example, let's say we do take these, but I don't want them to have like that plucky effect. I could slow the attack down and all of a sudden, I don't have that anymore. Maybe I want to make a pad out of this. And the sustain up even more. So we started with a pluck, now we have a pad out of it. Because in my ears, all I give a shit about is the timbre. Is this a dope sound? Now I'm gonna make it do whatever the hell I wanna make it do. That to me is what a preset is. A preset is just a crayon that I can color whatever the hell I wanna color, but I'm always gonna have to get in here and make sure the shape fits what I'm going for. Let me give you some cool tips with this. If you're going for, let's talk about how MIDI ties into this. So let's say, let me just bring in some sort of drum loop here. A little bit. All right, this has some room for a bass line. So let's say I just have a basic loop. And this will apply across the board, any genre. It's more just a concept. Okay, let's talk about different bass types and how MIDI is going to affect ADSR. So let's say I want something shorter. Let's go up here. All right. And I want to come up with some sort of pattern here. First mistake a lot of people make is they just pencil their notes to always touch each other. Why? Because it looks good. Big, big, big mistake. When I do this, I'm losing parts of my ADSR because what I'm doing here is making these notes legatoed, meaning they're touching one another. Now, if I'm going for something more rhythmical and short and punchy, this is not going to allow me to do that because it can, but I'm going to lose control over the release because the release allows me to shape the tail. And when these notes are so close to each other like this, one after another, I kind of lose control over that release. Where watch what happens if I just shorten this. Listen to the dynamics. doesn't matter what my the ADSR is the same, but notice how the MIDI note length is going to affect this. Now I could keep them longer. Whoops. And let's just say only do a little decay. That can work. But I also kind of lose control because I can only work with my decay, which is a constant fading parameter. If I start to bring this up, we're back to the long sustained notes. Remember, decay is always a fading parameter. Sometimes people just turn decay up and do these long notes. Not a smart thing because decay is always getting quieter. So I can make a shorter, pluckier kind of version of this, but I don't have much control because the only thing I could touch is the decay. Where instead, if I can just make my note shorter, I can now kind of connect them again using the release, but it's going to give me more dynamics versus doing it this way. So for example, this makes it sound like this, where each note is just connected. Where instead, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say, okay, let's shorten these notes to something like this. And now it's going to create the volume, but then I can use the release to control the dynamic tail between each hit. And this is going to allow me to get the exact shape and feeling I want, where if my notes are long, I lose control over the release. I can't do this. Watch this difference. This is huge. And especially with bass lines, this is so important. Watch how much customization I could do to this sound now with MIDI note length and getting the control over my release back. So I can go for a very short note with a longer release, or I can go with a longer note, shorter release. Depends on what I'm going for, right? But do you see how I have flexibility by shortening my notes? I can shape this dynamically in a bunch of different ways. Where if we just make these legato, I can't. And this is that thing where it just sounds like this and there's no change in anything. It's fucking horrible. This is what so many presets are going to cause. And if you're always doing these long notes for a punchy pattern, it's never going to work. Here's the tip. I will always make my MIDI notes shorter than I typically want, because I can always fill that gap with release. And release is a dynamic feature, right? It's fading time. But that is a dynamic tail, your release. High to low. It fades. So for me, I always like to go shorter. All right, let's open up a preset. I'm going to show you now. So like, let's just say we go to... Okay. Now this is what the envelope is giving me. I can adjust this however I want. Oh, we haven't got here yet, so let me... All right, let's say I was going to go even harder to fit in rolling bass line. It's another good example. And let's say, let's go a little slower. All right, let's say I want to even make this something higher. All right, let's even do this cool. Like, let's say this was something that was more. Sounds like shit. Do you hear how I can do this by ear though and adjust it to fit like rhythmically, the groove, the shape to fit? This is where I am spending 99% of my time. It's not in an EQ. It's not in a compressor. It's finding the sound I like and then spending 5 minutes in an ADSR with the MIDI notes to get it to fit my vibe that I'm going for. Now, if I am going for longer sustained notes, let's say this is a sustained bass line, sure, I want my notes to be legatoed. I want these things to be connected. And I probably want to make sure that my envelope is also jacked up with the sustain. This works. If that's my goal, if that's the type of like layer I want for this, then I want the notes to be longer. But keep in mind with MIDI notes, don't just like always have them look perfect and connect, really adjust the length. But I always like to go a little bit shorter if it's a dynamic, punchy pattern, because that's going to allow me to get the most value out of my ADSR. And I can go shorter with the notes, longer with the release, shape the tail that way. Or I can go longer with the notes, shorter with the release, and that still gives me some dynamic space. But basically what we're trying to do is instead of going block to block, that's not dynamic. We want to end a little bit shorter and be able to control that tail and create this in between. That's what we're doing when we shorten the notes and play with the release. This is how you're going to get those like realistic sounding parts. Usually when you hear a track that sounds muddy, it's because the shape of the sound has nothing to do with mixing. The shape in the ADSR is just wildly off for what would have fit the mix better or what the intention was to fit in the mix. This is so important though. Like I really believe you could take any song you have, not change the patches, that were like an older song you made, just live in the ADSR and I guarantee you can make it better. As you get better with ADSR control, it's that important. All right, so that's like basic layer 1 ADSR. Let's talk LFO, then we're gonna go to layer 2 ADSR because we're gonna talk about mod envelopes, which are taking this shape to a whole nother level. I showed you like basic shit where we can make the sound 8 to 10 times cooler with mod envelopes, but let me just go over LFOs quick. So LFOs. Down here, you'll see we have 2 of them. This stands for low frequency oscillator. Now, the reason I don't like to teach Serum is because, like I said earlier, people who only learn on Serum have no idea how to use an LFO on any other synth except Serum. Because Serum is cool. It allows you to draw whatever shape you want in and make your sound wobble to that shape. That ain't going to work on any other synth though. You have to know what an LFO is and how to control it. It's so easy to that it almost makes Serum easier to use after. So what an LFO does, it's a modulator. So it's going to modulate a parameter And basically, imagine if you said to yourself, I want to modulate a knob to kind of turn in my project, but I don't want to have to sit there and physically keep turning that knob. That's what an LFO can do for you. An LFO can kind of repeat a pattern of turning a knob or a parameter over and over so you don't have to physically sit there and keep turning that knob. So for example, let's say I wanted to have my filter go, and I thought this was the coolest thing. And I wanted to do that, but I don't want to sit here and have to turn that knob all day. I can have an LFO control that for me and modulate that filter cutoff to just go womp, 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 and keep going. And I can make it go faster. I can make it go slower. So how an LFO works is it controls a parameter and it will control it by following the phase cycle of one of these wave shapes. So it's an actual oscillator that produces a frequency low enough where we won't hear it. And what's going to happen is your knob, your parameter, is going to move based on the position of these different wave shapes and their phase cycle. So I'll draw this out. It makes it a little easier to understand. Let's say I have a sine wave and we want to do the filter control. So a sine wave looks like this in its phase cycle. Start, finish. All right. So what this would mean then is, let's say the filter at the start is 12 o'clock position. The cutoff is right in the middle. When it reaches this point up here, the filter now might be at 3 o'clock. Then we're back in the middle. So we're back at 12 o'clock. Then it comes to the bottom, the opposite of 3 o'clock. So over here, the filter is now at 9 p.m., whatever. And then we're back to the starting point again. Filter's back at 12 o'clock. So all that happened was exactly what we did. The knob turned left, right, left, right. But how does it know where to turn left and right and when? It's just based on where that wave shape is in its cycle. That knob will just turn as that wave goes through its cycle. So if the wave is produced at a higher frequency and it starts to speed up, that knob will speed up. If that oscillator produces this wave at a lower frequency and it slows down, your knob will slow down. So let me show you how this works now. We're just going to tell the LFO to control that filter cutoff. So I'm going to choose cutoff. And okay, now the next thing we'll do here is the important parameters. First off is going to be our gain. This is just going to be the volume of this oscillator. You got to give it some volume to produce that wave shape so we hear the effect. So that's what this is. The rate is how fast it's going to produce this wave shape. Does it do it fast and then your knob will turn quickly? Or does it produce it at a lower frequency at a slower rate and then your knob will turn slower? We also have the ability to sync this up to our BPM or put it in free mode. So if you wanted this to be like perfectly at whatever BPM you're working in and rhythmically, wobble and produce with that BPM, whatever it is, 140, 120, this will do it. It'll automatically sync it up. Or you could put it in free mode where as we change this rate and speed, it'll just go at its own speed that I control. I'm going to do that for now. I'm going to unsync it so it's not linked up to the BPM of my track, just for the sake of this example. The next most important one is this black knob here, which is called the amount knob. Now, what this will represent, or even the range, you'll see this sometimes called, this is basically how far it's telling this cutoff to move when it reaches the peak of the phase cycle and the trough of the phase cycle. So the peaks and valleys, high and low, when it's at its height, this will tell it how far to turn, as well as when it's at its low, how far does it turn in the opposite direction. So for example, let's say I start with my cutoff at 12 o'clock and I only turn this black knob a little bit. That means it's only going to go womp, 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 something like that. But if I increase the range, this will now open further to each side. If I go even further, same thing. It'll go boom, 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 boom. And if I bring it back, it'll just go a little, and this will just determine which side it goes to first. So let's say I start to now press my note and I'm going to increase the range. Let's just see what happens. So I'm holding the note and you hear it's open, close, open, close. Now, if I start to speed this up, right? Watch this. You put a little bit of reverb on this and all of a sudden it's that sound you've heard a million times. Not that hard to make. How many of you remember a couple years back, Dioro 5 Hour? I think you did it with Chris Brown. That song. All right, flip this to a saw wave. I don't know the key. I think it might have been D. Let's see if. Okay. And then the song starts dun 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 dun. This is literally how the song starts. It starts with a saw wave, the lead instrument, with an LFO also in a saw wave. And then it goes right into the melody. Dum 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 dum. So what we could do is we could even change this wave shape in the LFO and notice the characteristics change. A sine wave is smooth. This sounds smooth. A saw wave is more jagged. This sounds more jagged. Now what's cool is we're just doing this on the cutoff right now. What happens if I change this to the pitch? Let's go to a sine wave, and let's say you want to create like a vibrato type effect. And you can speed it up, you could slow it down. Let's say RC20, are we familiar with that plugin that does all that magic that no other plugin can do? I'm kidding me? Every single synth you have can do that same pitch wobble that people spend all the money on RC20 for. I have the plugin. It's easy, it's convenient, but watch this. I'm going to set this to a random wave, control the pitch, and now I could just futz with the time, the amount of the pitch I want. And all of a sudden I have like that old kind of like vinyl weird tape wobble that's going on, because all I'm telling it to do is randomly modulate my pitch, and I could choose how fast, how far I want the pitch to drift, the range, the amount. Say I want to do panning. Let's go back to that white noise example. Let's say you want to dress your sweep up and be even cooler. All of a sudden you can make it go like this and move around. These things become endless if you just understand the tool. Like LFOs are fucking awesome. They don't just do the dubstep wobbles. You can make this do a million things. And I find there's so many practical uses for this, but even more so, you are going to load presets sometimes that may be doing an LFO shape that you don't need, knowing how to turn it off. Or doing a shape that you want a different version of, you being able to go in there and change those settings. Because again, if you like the timbre of something, you need to be able to adjust everything else to fit your needs. But you have to be comfortable going into an LFO to turn it off, to change the parameters, to make it fit your timing and rhythm, to change the wave shape inside that LFO. These are things that you're going to have to be able to do. And it's just comfort level. It's knowing what's going on, what it does, how to control it, and then being able to adjust as you go, because no doubt presets are going to have these things turned on from the start. So that's the basics of an LFO, and I'll show you as we get into Serum. Let's quickly open that up, and I want to show you like the equivalents now. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to open up Serum, and the first thing we're going to do is locate source, modifiers, controllers, the same three things. And you're going to notice there's a reason why Serum looks the way it looks. It's laid out a certain way for a reason. All right. Source is our oscillators. So I have a sub oscillator, a noise oscillator, and then oscillators A and B. Here's my source. Modifiers, filter and amp, right? Amp, right underneath, go figure, is the filter. Controllers, LFOs and envelopes. What do I have at the bottom? My envelopes and LFOs. Now that this makes sense with source modifier controllers, you're going to see every synth flows perfectly. Source modifiers controllers. It's the same shit. I'll quickly just open up one that looks scarier than this. What the fuck is this? What are we looking at? Same shit. Here's my source section. I have 3 oscillators. This is the octave control. Here's my individual note. So like this would be octave, this would be note. Here are my waveforms for the 3 oscillators that I could choose from. The volume for each. If I jump over to here, so just a quick heads up, VCO is another thing you'll see for oscillators. That stands for voltage controlled oscillator. But if you see VCO, that also means oscillator. VCF is my filter, voltage controlled filter. So here's my modifier right here and here. Then I have my controllers. Here's my envelopes. I have 2 of them, ADSR. I can make this true ADSR here. They give you different types. And then my LFOs are down here. I have 2 of them. Same shit. So as you start to open up more and more of these synths, you're going to notice they're all built the same way. They just look different. And most of the patches we're going to start adjusting are going to come down to source modifier controller. So let me come back to Serum and let me initialize the patch here. And let's do quickly. So here's the random phase. That would be this. That was the retrig. As far as like LFOs, how do you use them in Serum? So you just click whichever LFO you want and drag it to a parameter. So let's do that same saw wave example. Now, by default, if you notice that I dragged it to the cutoff and it did this thing with the blue light, and there's always like a little notch you can click and drag in the top left here to adjust this blue light. That's the same as the black knob, which was the range and the amount. This is going to tell you how far that parameter is going to wobble with the LFO. So if I open this further, it just means the cutoff will kind of move to here, to here, here to here. If I only go a little, it's only going to go there to there, there to there, and so forth. Now, let's say you want it to only turn in one direction, which we're going to want from time to time. If you hold on Mac, it's Option Shift. Notice it only goes to one direction now. So it'll start from the cutoff and go to there, back to the cutoff, there, back to the cutoff. If I press Option Shift again, it's going to go boom, 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 and the cutoff stays in the middle. It's just options you have. 2 ways you can control it. You'll see it used both ways. So if you ever watch a tutorial, a lot of people don't use it this way. They do the Option Shift thing where it looks like this. Basically, your cutoff becomes the one extreme. Option Shift will let you go between the 2 of them. On PC, I'm going to assume it's Alt Shift. That's my guess. It's one of your combinations. So that just allows you to flip between the 2, but that's the difference. It's just where the cutoff is in relation to the range. I typically like to use this one. I like when the cutoff is one of the extremes, and then I could just control the other extreme through the amount. So it'll go from here to there, there to there, there to there. All right, so let's turn the filter on. We are also not on the right synth. Perfect. Okay. So there's the range. And Serum visually is amazing. So they do a couple things. They have the light in this little line kind of showing you where it is. That little blue light that dances. And then you could also just watch the filter. Now down here, I have my wave shapes. Now, if I click the folder, you do have some shapes already here. So let's say I want to do a sine. I can click the folder, go to basic, choose sine. Here's the BPM to sync it up to BPM. Or if I want to go to free mode, I could just click this. And then I could also click and drag these. So all I have to do is click and drag this to any parameter. Let's say I want this to go to the, let's do the detune for some reason. And now it's running an LFO through the detune, like randomness. This is the cool part about sound design, randomly dropping shit, but it's kind of like controlled chaos. You almost, and you can see it's making the detune kind of go crazy as it follows this LFO. So you could just click and drag this onto any parameter, and that allows you to do the LFOs here. So if you do open up a preset and it has some LFO modulation, you can also just right click and it'll show you what it's controlling, which is helpful. You could then choose if you want to just turn those off. You can bypass them all, or you could just choose to bypass a specific parameter. Like maybe it has like the reverb doing an LFO and you're like, I don't want that. I don't want it to be the LFO. You could just turn off the LFO on the reverb by doing it there. Or if you want to turn them all off, click that. And now it's just a regular old saw wave with no LFO control. All right, the next little part I want to stack on now, this is my favorite, is mod envelopes. So before we talked about the envelope as the amp envelope. In Serum, ADSR number one, envelope number one is our amp envelope. So here's my attack, decay, sustain, release. What hold is, it's just an extra feature they give you before the decay. If you wanted, you could kind of like almost sustain the attack, then go into a decay. There are times it can come in handy, absolutely, but that's what hold is. It basically can create like a sustain on your attack before you get into the dynamic shape of your sound. So just further control. But here's my ADSR, and they do give you time, volume level, and time. And the cool thing about Serum is you could also curve these ADSRs. Just more control to shape your sounds. Really, really cool shit. So let's say I want to give you a thing that we probably have heard a bunch of times. I think deadmau5 has made this wildly popular over time. All right, so let's say with these, we did this dynamic example earlier, where I could take these and sure, I could shorten them. Cool. But let's take it one step further using a second envelope on this one sound. So a common thing you're going to see, to the point where so many hardware synths come built in this way, they will have a second envelope that is controlling the filter cutoff. So what does this mean? A lot of synths will come built this way, where there's an envelope, an ADSR, that controls the filter cutoff, meaning what we were doing with the LFO before, where it was opening and closing, LFOs will keep repeating as long as that note is triggered. What we can also do, though, is have that filter cutoff open and close with the shape of an envelope. So basically, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tell this envelope, let me just redo it again real fast, to go on top of this cutoff. And basically what I'm going to say is every time the node is triggered, I just want the cutoff to open and close once, and it'll stay closed, open and closed. But you're going to notice as I do this, it's going to create this like extra tight pluck sound. So what's happening is the filter is opening and closing, but how fast does it know to open? How fast does it know to close? That process of open, close, the time it takes is basically just going to be controlled by this ADSR. So for example, I drag this envelope to my filter. Right now, my filter is closed all the way. We're not hearing anything. But if I start to open the range, we're back to the original saw wave. Now I'm going to bring this ADSR all the way down. Everything is going to come all the way down here. Okay. Now, as I bring my, let's say, decay, let's start with attack, the first one. What is attack? How long it takes the sound to reach its loudest point. Now, this isn't a sound because it's not controlling the amp. This isn't the volume. Amp envelope, envelope 1, ADSR 1 is controlling the amp envelope. This is controlling the filter. So attack is going to be how long it takes the filter to open to its loudest or furthest point. So if I slow the attack down, watch what happens in here. It takes 928 milliseconds to reach its furthest point. If I stretch this out further, it takes longer to open the filter. So it's just shaping how the filter opens. Okay, then what would decay be? How long it takes something to reach a level of sustain. So I'm going to go with a fast attack, which means the filter will open immediately. And the decay is how long it takes the filter to close to a level of sustain. 1.15 seconds to reach a sustain, which is set at 0. What happens if I bring that 0 up? Notice the filter holds out. So now it's going to take 1.15 seconds to reach that level and hold. Or 1.15 seconds to reach a level of being completely closed. Or I can make it take longer. Like you'll hear this on a lot of bass instruments sometimes. It'll be like, where it's like boom, and it kind of closes over time. It has that dynamic shape. That's how they're doing it. They're having the first note pop the filter open, and then it just slowly decays down. So like, whoops, didn't want to do that. Bring this to the... All right, now what happens if I want it to hold? I could bring that up. I don't want the filter to open as far. Let's bring the range down. Reverb on this. All we're doing is further shaping our sound through a filter now rather than just the amp envelope. Earlier when we were messing with envelopes, that was just like the pure volume of the sound, and we were shaping that sound. Now we're further shaping the sound by having the filter open and close, which gives us a whole new set of things. So let me now show you some cool shit, like practical shit we could do with this. As long as you understand that this envelope just controls filter open, filter close. That's all that's happening. How can we use this to our advantage now? So let's go back to an initialized patch. My original notes here, let's go a little bit longer, are going to sound like this. All right, not as dynamic. This is my amp envelope. Now what I'm going to do is Turn on my filter. Let's bring a secondary envelope onto here. I'm going to press Option Shift to get that one direction kind of thing. And I'm going to close this. Now, on the second envelope, I'm going to bring everything down here. And what we're going to do is create a secondary shape for this instrument. So when the filter's open, we're basically on our envelope 1 amp envelope. But when filter closes, I'm going to have the ability to have a secondary shape through envelope 2. So watch this. I can start to make this like a tighter pluck. Okay. And as I start to open this up, what envelope are we back to when the filter's open? The longer one, the bigger one, the louder version. But when I close this cutoff, we now transition to this shorter, tighter envelope. So what have I just created? I've created the ability to have the dynamics of my sound change as I just open and close my filter cutoff. I can go from a nice tight pluck just by turning one knob. I can get two completely different versions of this sound. And I could automate that parameter. Think about like if this were like a breakdown and I wanted to create tension and build up over time. I think it would be something like. Whoops. Sorry. My thumb. I'm not doing anything except touching one knob and it's creating tension. Why? Because my sound is changing over time. That is music, the change of sound over time. The more value you can get out of your sounds by having them evolve and change, the better your music's going to be. And the less shit you're going to have to dump into your tracks. When a track feels stale, it's often because there is no change in your sound. So we've been kind of talking about this in the one-on-ones and in class. How can we change our sound over time? We talked about filtering. And we said filters are a great way to change your sound over time. But we were kind of just talking about a filter outside of the synth. Now, what is the big difference here? If I have my sound and I just do the auto filter, you know, your basic DAWs filter, your EQ, there's a big difference between me just going like this it's changing, but that's not the same as me doing it with the filter in my synth and having an envelope routed to it. Because this one is also changing the shape over time. And what's cool about this is that I always like to think about this as creating, if I can, not for every sound, but on sounds that I want to automate, usually my lead sounds, I like to think about having two shapes because it then gives me the ability over time throughout my track to present the same sound in different ways. And that's me getting more value out of my sound as time goes on. This is like the most fundamental sound design trick that you hear in literally every single song. When you hear that sound evolving and changing, 9 out of 10 times it's the filter cutoff. they're automating that to change over time. And there's two different envelope shapes, which allow it to give you two completely different sounds. So like, for example, I could even have this. So like when the filter's open here, fast attack, slow attack, fast attack, slow attack. I could vary this however I want, but the whole point here is the change over time. I saw there were some hands too. I'm going to come at the end. I want to show you a couple more things before I open up to questions. I'll give you an example of the other way around now. So like, let's take the longer sustain bass. Let's say I wanted to create a bass line for this. And let's just. The fuck? There we go. Okay. All right, let me put kickstart on here just to get some pump, and we're gonna make this a bass line, but I'm gonna show you how we can shape this to like groove with the song just based on the envelope itself. This is kind of cool now, but the shape, maybe I want to be a little bit different. So let's close this. Let's open up a secondary envelope. All right, see how that's closing too quick? Like this doesn't sound good. All right, maybe I want to have it hold out a sustain. But do you hear how it's adding shape? It's boom and then coming down, boom, boom, rather than just being volume, flat, sustain. This is creating dynamic ups and downs. This is shaping my sound, and I could make this fit in any way I want. Like if the notes were quicker, right? Something like this where the notes are even faster. Now I could change the shape to fit if I need. So it's all about just understanding ADSR, what it's going to control, but this is shaping a sound. This is giving your sound just anything other than that flat, plastered kind of feel. And what you'll start to notice is if I just load up a preset, so let's say this is the bass that I want. Let's just make it one long one. All right, back to this. Let's just choose a preset now. And I'll go to something like... So I could just find a sound I like. It's not even take a bass. Let's take something that's like a lead. All right, so say something like this. I want to put more shape in, and maybe I even want this, truthfully, to be a rolling bass line, but I like the sound of this. Same shit. I could just take it for its... Put an envelope. I ain't doing any sound design. Like, I'm just using what they're giving me and fucking with the settings to get my needs. Do you see how much easier this shit becomes? I don't have to sit here and create the sound. I just find dope sounds I like, then make them fit my needs, make them fit what I'm trying to do, make sure the shape fits my needs, the envelopes fit my needs. If there's something going on with an LFO that I don't want, whether it's changing the rate, like this, if I hear this and I don't want that, I may say, okay, I noticed this is on, let's just bypass it. And now I just have the synth as its own synth. Or maybe I just didn't like the rate it was doing. I'll activate them and I'll change this to the rate I want. Or change the shape. You don't have to sit there and create every patch, but you should be able to manipulate these patches to fit your needs, and it's always the same thing. Within the oscillator, it might be messing with the voices, the detune, the octave control. With your filter, it's usually playing with some sort of envelope that might be controlling it. With the LFOs, what is that controlling? Is it a filter? Is it the volume? And it's just finding the sound you like, but then making it fit your needs in terms of its shape. And to me, that's where you have to be spending most of your time. Like, don't use a plugin to fix bad shape. Your shit should sound good by choosing a good sound and getting the shapes of all your instruments to fit well together. That's everything. That eliminates almost all the competitive EQ stuff. Like, most people who are doing the subtractive EQ in their mix is because they have too much overlap in their actual dynamics and sounds. And they're trying to fix that with EQ, but the actual issue is the shapes of the sounds are overlapping. All right, I know we went over a bunch. Questions?
I think it's just playing with it and getting to know it.
100%. 100%.
By the way, sorry, really quick, are these recorded or being recorded?
So I only flipped it on
recording on the top, but like that way I can like study it on a separate occasion of myself. too?
I only really turned
Or
it
go
on like
back to it?
Chanel had to leave, so I only flipped it on a little while ago. It's only been on for probably like
Oh,
5-10 minutes.
okay.
We typically don't record them only because we
Okay.
used to in the beginning, and sure enough, what did we find? No one paid attention in class. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's
Well, I mean, I definitely have ADD, so there's times where I'm like paying attention, and then I'll just be
totally,
like, so that's why I was like, you know what, let me ask if these are being recorded, just so that when I have my time to sit down, I can like actually go through it
so
again
the
and
last
again.
like
I retain
probably
information very slow. That's just like me though. Like
the last
I'm
like
very
10
bad at
minutes
that.
have been,
Okay,
but
that's fine. But like not future ones.
no,
We're
we
not,
typically only if someone has to leave or
okay.
something, we'll flip it on. But
Got
for
you,
this
got
point,
you.
I probably only started about 5-10 minutes ago, so I kind of missed the whole first half if you needed that.
No,
But
no, I was taking notes for that first stuff. I'm just saying for future lessons, if like, yeah, if I have to leave or if it's just
yeah,
I'm
you
a
just let me
person
know.
that retains information a bit slower. And like I like to go back to reference videos and then try it myself and then pause and then go back and then kind of like go back and forth, just so that I can kind of get
Totally,
my hands on and doing it myself, so I can actually retain the information, be like, oh, okay, I see what he's doing. Like, but I don't know if you get what I'm saying. But anyways, I was
100%.
just wondering if we do record them.
Jessica, you had a question too, right? I think your
Sorry.
mic might. Yeah, there you are. Here.
Sorry. How do you actually automate the second envelope affecting the LFO cutoff? Like, how do I
Totally.
make that work?
So usually, what you're going to automate in these instances, there's no rules to this. But in most cases, you're just going to automate this parameter here, your filter cutoff. So basically, how I would typically approach this in most cases, there's no rules to it. But basically, what I would do is I would have where am I? My two envelope setup. So if this was my amp and this was the filter one, I would basically get this set up how I wanted it to be. Something like that. And then if I wanted to have that change over time, I'm going to be automating this specific one. So it's the filter cutoff. It would be the filter inside of Serum, and it's the cutoff parameter itself. And then we could just choose to automate this however we want in here, whether I want it to be up over time, or if you even want to do cool, like shorter instances where you even just make it almost like rhythmical on every couple notes, you could do cool shit like this. So much of this is even creative to a certain extent. But if you just wanted to do like that gradual automation over time, it's going to be the filter cutoff itself. So like in Logic, you would just go to Serum, filter cutoff, and it's that specific parameter you would automate. You were Logic, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
But as Alex was saying, like this is going to be a practice thing. It's like seeing what each part does, and then no doubt, like have no fear either. Just like fuck around with it in the beginning. Literally get comfortable just turning these things and messing around, because all it is starting to connect like what you hear when you turn such knob. That almost like if you could just understand that from sound design, where you understand, oh, when I turn this knob, it does this. When I turn that knob, it does that. That's usually enough to start manipulating sounds, where I'm probably not the most technical person with sound design. In my head, I'm kind of like, oh, that makes it go like womp, womp, womp. This makes it do this kind of like, I kind of think of it that way. But as long as you have a weird way of understanding how these knobs connect and what sounds they can make, it definitely helps.
I actually
Gotcha.
do have another question, if nobody else does, really quick. Underneath the, does someone have one?
I'll come to you after shit.
Oh, I can't see everyone's.
No,
I'm
totally,
so sorry.
totally.
I can't see everybody's thing. It's on the sidebar. Sorry.
You're all good. I don't think your mic's working. Yeah, you're good. You're good. Yeah. So 100%. You could just hit record and it will record your automation if you wanted to do it live. Absolutely. Like there are times I sit here with this little controller here and I'll map out, like if I wanted to like humanize it, I'll map it out to one of these knobs and I'll just turn the knob over time while it's playing back and literally record the automation in. Just hit record, start turning that knob and it will record those automation points. The only thing that kind of sucks is it makes it very jagged. So like every time you move that, it creates like a new automation point. So you end up having like fucking 1,000 automation points in a really small area, but it definitely still works. What people typically do is they'll record it like gradually in, and then they'll take like the major points and just clear out the ones in the middle, but you can record them in if you want. The other thing you could also do too is like, sometimes I'll just play with it without the record, because you do have to hit record in order to record the automation up top. You would have to hit record up top. Sometimes I'll just play it back and like perform it in the synth while it's playing, but I look at the red line. So I almost see what the red line is doing, and then I'll go in and pencil in roughly what that range is, and it gets me closer to what I'm trying to do. But yeah, if you want to record, just hit the record button and then start to do your automation and it will. Definitely. Got Alex.
So where it says the filter underneath that MG low 12, I always wanted to understand what those mean. Like I always kind of like when I use them, there's like the arrow, because then it goes 12, 24.
Yep.
And then what's the other one? 18 or yeah, those.
So this is
what
the
exactly
slopes from last week. So MG, I believe, is just their like Moog kind of filter.
Mode,
They
yeah.
have all different kind of filter types, but the numbers just represent the slope, like we kind of talked about last week, where the higher dB per octave number means the slope of the filter is more steep. So here, wait, let me open up ProQ real quick. And it's funny because we're going to talk about this again tonight at the end when we do the EQing part. So like if you remember these filter slopes here, that's what that is, those numbers. So the 12 would be the 12 dB per octave, the 24, the 18, it's all these. And the names will just represent the different filter types and emulations that they have. So think of it like they're all kind of filters, just different flavors, different characteristics.
Got it. Okay. So it's the same idea of that.
Same idea, totally. And I'll say this, like the higher the number also though, usually if you're going to use this for like the plucks and stuff, it definitely changes the sound. Like if you change the number, it does have an impact on how things sound. I always feel like the higher number, it's a little bit tighter, more exaggerated sound. The lower the number, like a more gradual slope of a filter, it's a little more subtle. But you could always mess around with the different numbers and just see which one kind of sounds best. But they're doing generally the same thing. As long as it's still a low pass, 12, 18, or 24, that's just the slope, how steep. All right.
Also
Oh,
one
go for
last
it.
thing, really
Totally.
quick. This has nothing. Well, it kind of is, but I would like if you know any references or places to download some more like packs or like this. I liked a couple of the sounds you were using. I know
So-
are not stock, but if you have like a reference or a place to like go to, that would be helpful too.
Let's see. Splice has a lot of shit on there. The only thing with Splice that I'm not crazy about for their preset packs, they play you like the sound, but it's not in your track. Like it's not your melody, whatever it is. So it's kind of hard to imagine what it would sound like. But Splice is always a decent spot. I really like a lot of like the PML stuff for presets. Production Music Live has really good presets. This dude, Bound to Divide, he has some really good stuff. He used to work for Production Music Live, but quality wise, his presets are really nice. He'll make like a combination of more like organic house type sounds and more like analog-ish type sounds. But his packs are pretty good. Yeah, it's tough. I probably have too much shit in here. I feel like I use the same 3 packs over and over. I have so much shit. I will say this, when you get into the group, everyone shares a lot of these things. So when you get put in the main Facebook group, people download packs and just share them with everyone in the group. So like people downloaded some serum pack and they'll post it up in there. Someone the other day posted like gigabytes of serum preset packs and folders. So people share a lot of shit when you get in the group. I would almost say if it's like samples or presets, hold off until you get put in the group, because you could always use the search feature and there's a ton of shit already there that people share. Go for it. Yes, totally. So you can even just organize the main one itself. What's cool is if you click the menu and go to show serum presets folder, it'll actually show you the Finder folder here. So these are all located in the preset folder, and then here's all the banks that appear inside of Serum. So you can create your own folders in here, save them to your own folder if you wanted to. Like you could have your own favorites folder within here. They give you like a user folder where you could save your shit into, but technically if you just do that, it'll bring you to this folder and you could organize this however the hell you want. You could put your own custom, best presets folder within here, and it'll show up like it's its own bank inside of Serum. Yeah, so menu, show serum presets folder. And that'll take you in here. And then the other trick too, for anything that's always file related, this is a good tip. If you ever just want shit to appear on top, just put the exclamation point in front. So like these are two I use. These are probably three I use the most. So I just put an exclamation point in front of the folder and it always puts them right on top. So I don't have to go hunting for them. All right, let's do this. Let's pause, because the next part, we're going to talk about the actual sound selection process. And you're going to see it's not hard, but we would need to be able to manipulate certain things. So we're going to go over the process. I want to show you a project or two. I'll probably even show you. Maybe I'll do a quick drum layering thing as well, and we'll kind of finish. We probably truthfully only have about 40 minutes left. We probably won't be here much later than midnight. The next part is kind of quick. It's self-explanatory. So let's take like 5-10 minutes. It's been a little bit of a stretch. We'll come back and we'll finish up.